OK, bienvenue. Je suis content qu'on peut faire notre première séminaire après COVID ici en présentiel, ici à l'UQAM. C'est un événement organisé par la Chaire sur la décarbonisation ici à l'UQAM. C'est intitulé en anglais. Ça va être un séminaire en anglais où en fait, c'est lié à un partenaire de recherche qui est basé ici à l'UQAM, mais qui implique des chercheurs des États-Unis et ailleurs, au Canada, Ontario, Québec. Le JCCTRP, le partenaire de recherche conjoint sur le climat et les transports. Moi, c'est Mark Purdon, titulaire de la Chaire sur la décarbonisation. Je vais switcher en anglais because this seminar has it will be held in English, which I think is quite okay. We have a number of distinguished panelists that have joined us from United States, and we are still awaiting one additional colleague who is coming in from Ontario. But the title of our seminar is Advancing Climate and Transportation Policy Research in Canada in the US, and it's part of a joint clean climate transport research partnership. And so we have a number of guests here, and I'm just going to sort of draw your attention to speak to their backgrounds a little bit. But we really have a great collection of speakers and experts on issues of transportation and climate change policy and how we can really reduce greenhouse gases in the transportation sector, which is the largest source of emissions here in Quebec, but also in California, and I believe in most parts of New England. Basically, most parts of North America, the transportation sector is the largest source of emissions. So if we're going to really reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, we need to target the transportation sector. So we're going to first have a talk from James Bradbury, who is the Mitigation Program Director at the Georgetown Climate Center, where he works at the nexus of federal and state policy efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions through facilitation, convening, and analysis. James manages the Transportation and Climate Initiative, a collaboration amongst 13 Northeast and Mid-Atlantic states and the District of Columbia to reduce transportation sector emissions. James is primarily focused on supporting state leaders working to advance equitable low-carbon transportation solutions. He previously worked at the U.S. Department of Energy, the World Resources Institute, and on Capitol Hill for Representative Jay Inslee. James holds a PhD in geosciences from UMass Amherst, an MS in hydrology from the University of New Hampshire, and a BA in geology from Colorado College. I think I'll just go run through all the bios and then I'll hand it over. Our second speaker will be Jonathan Rubin, who is the director of the Margaret Chase Smith Policy Center and professor of economics at the University of Maine. Professor Rubin received his PhD in agricultural economics from the University of California, Davis. He was the Fulbright Canada Research Chair in Environment and Economy, Institute of the Environment, University of Ottawa, over 2021-22. Is an advisory panel, National Cooperative Highway Research Program 2556, methods for state DOTs to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from the transport sector. He is a member of the Equity Subcommittee and the Scientific and Technical Subcommittee of the Maine Climate Council, which is a body that's been drawn together by the government of Maine. And Dr. Rubin specializes in economics of energy, light-duty transportation, greenhouse gas emissions, and alternative fuels. His research investigates the environmental impacts of connected autonomous vehicles, low-carbon transportation fuels, and biofuel pathways. So we're very happy to have Professor Rubin with us. Our third speaker is Lou Fulton. He is the director of the Sustainable Transportation Energy Pathways Program at the Institute of Transportation Studies at University of California, Davis. Before joining UC Davis in 2012, he worked at the International Energy Agency in Paris for 12 years, the UN Environmental Program in Nairobi for for 2 years and the U.S. Department of Energy for 4 years. And we're also very happy to have him with us. Our fourth speaker is en route, but I'll introduce him now because I've received text messages that he is landed, is Mark Winfield. He is a professor of environmental and urban change at York University. He is also co-chair of the Faculty Sustainable Energy Initiative and coordinator for the Joint Master of Environmental Studies JD program offered in conjunction with Osgoode Hall Law School. He has published articles, book chapters, and reports on a wide range of climate change, environment, and energy law and policy topics. Professor Winfield has acted as an advisor to the Environmental Commissioner of Ontario and Federal Commissioner for Environment and Development. From 2017-2020, he served as a member of the Conseil d'administration Board of Directors of Transition Énergétique Québec, a Crown corporation established in Quebec to implement a low-carbon energy transition study for Quebec. He is currently co-editing a volume on sustainable energy transitions for Canada, opportunities and challenges for UBC Press. And I think he can confirm, but I think that that book is now in press. So I think that's a great amount of introductions, and maybe I'll step back and I'll give the floor to James Bradbury, who I believe has a presentation here prepared.
Yeah, I have a couple slides. Thank you, Mark. Can folks hear me okay? Great. I see nodding in the back. That's good. Okay. I guess you'll be, is there a clicker, or you'll advance the slides?
I'll just advance. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Bonsoir. It's a pleasure to be here with you this evening. And you could go to the next slide, please. So I'll be brief. I'll just begin with a short summary of my presentation. So I'm going to focus on really two recently passed laws in the United States and how they could affect transportation, and talk a little bit about the modeling we did to analyze that question. The first piece of legislation I'll talk about is the bipartisan infrastructure law that President Biden signed at the end of just about a year ago in November 2021. And this includes a lot of much needed funding for climate-friendly transportation investments. It's got historic levels of funding for transit and also for passenger rail, and for the first time, almost $10 billion in funding for electric vehicle charging infrastructure. I'll also briefly share some insights on the Inflation Reduction Act. This is the big sort of political win, policy win for the Biden administration that just passed through Congress in August. And it's also a nice complement to the bipartisan infrastructure law in a couple ways from the standpoint of transportation, and particularly transportation electrification. Next slide, please. So we did, the next three slides are summarizing the analysis we did of the bipartisan infrastructure law. It was about a $1 trillion over 5 years, but $600 billion of that was for transportation. And one of the main features of this bill is sort of a standard highway reauthorization. Every 5 years in the US, they put a lot of money into Congress authorizes a new slug of money for transportation. This one had a lot more than usual, including for the purposes I already mentioned, and for the first time for EV charging infrastructure. But the really important thing to understand and know about this legislation is there's a lot of flexibility in terms of how it gets implemented. That includes flexibility, some flexibility at the federal side, but most of that flexibility is on the state side. So they have what's called formula funding programs, where Congress decides on a certain formula given a certain population and other metrics of each state, and then that state will get a certain amount of money. And so that way, Congress decides which states get what amount of money. It's fairly equitable in many ways. But the point is that the states can kind of spend it on anything they want in a large part, at least within the parameters of the individual formula funding programs. So the reason I explained all that is to model it was tricky. We had to do two bounding scenarios. We have the scenario on your left, which is the high emission scenario, and in that one, we assume, for example, that almost 25%, almost a quarter of the dollars went to highway expansion projects. And in the low emission scenario, we assume there's very little highway expansion, and the money that would have gone to highway expansion goes to a lot of other really good things from a climate standpoint. Transit, electric vehicle charging, switching diesel buses to electric buses, and that sort of thing. And then we took these two different scenarios and plugged them into our modeling tool that we've developed, which essentially, the way that it works is, let me see, I've got a sort of simple way of describing it. So okay, I guess I don't have a good description of it, but it's a tool that basically, it has these different emission factors in it, where if you put a certain amount of dollars into, say, transit, it will tell you the emission reductions that you get from that. And it's got different area types as well. So if you're putting money into more suburban transit, you get a certain amount of reductions, but if you put it into urban transit, you usually get more emission reductions. So it has different details that will apply to different states. So we ran that for the whole United States, and in these two bounding scenarios. And the next slide gives you the results. And what you can see here is that there's a potential, if you look at the blue line, to reduce emissions from this bill compared to business as usual, where emissions would have gone otherwise. And that's great, but there's also the red line. So in the high emissions scenario, as you can see, that sort of in the first few years, emissions could decline. And that's as you put money into new highways, congestion is relieved, traffic flows more smoothly, but then those highways fill up through a process called induced demand. And then your emissions start to go up above what they would have otherwise been. So that's why you end up with that high emission scenario going actually higher than business as usual. But in the low emission scenario, again, you're putting money into things that reliably reduce emissions, and as a result, you get something that's lower than business as usual. Okay, next slide, please. And here, in this slide, we just looked at kind of breaking down those two scenarios into the different contributing factors. So if you look at the bar chart on the left, you can see over time, again, if you invest about 25% of your total transportation dollars into highway expansion, this could completely reverse the benefits, the emissions benefits of all the good things that you're investing in. And so the good things you're investing in are the multicolored things over here, medium duty and heavy duty trucks. You're switching some of those from diesel to electric. Light duty electric vehicles, you're electrifying those light duty trucks. You've got highway state of good repair, transit, freight, and other ways of improving the efficiency of our transportation systems. But on the right, if you really minimize the amount that goes to highway expansion below what historically has been spent on that, and you put those into good things, tens of billions of dollars for transit, billions of dollars switching from diesel to electric, then you can really move the needle. You can really get, over time, over a cumulative amount of time, this is cumulative emissions over the next almost 20 years, you could really get hundreds of millions of metric ton reductions. So that's really the bottom line, is you want to avoid highway expansion and you want to invest in almost anything else. Even state of good repair for highways can help reduce emissions on highways because the surface is smooth, vehicles travel more smoothly. Okay, finally, I'll just say a couple words about the Inflation Reduction Act. Really, this bill was centered more so on electricity and from generators to consumers. And a major portion of this bill, hundreds of billions of dollars worth of investment, a major portion of that is tax incentives for wind and solar. But it also has incentives for electric vehicles and also for building electrification. So essentially, this enables what we call beneficial electrification. It's sort of a climate policy term where if you're going to electrify your buildings and vehicles, you better make sure your grid is clean. In Canada, the grid's already pretty clean, so you can pretty much go straight to the next part, which is the electrification. At any rate, I think that's the main thing I want to say about that. There's in the bipartisan infrastructure law, the first bill I described is a lot of money for charging. This bill complements that nicely by having a lot of incentives for electric vehicles. And the last thing I'll say, and I think we can, the last thing I'll say, I'm not going to touch on all these points, is just there's a lot of work to do on implementation. This is an unprecedented level of money at the federal level. The Environmental Protection Agency has very few staff compared to what they did a few years ago, and they're trying to hire up, but they can't do it fast enough. Same is true for the transportation agencies, energy agencies. It's a huge lift. It's going to take a lot of work. And then even harder, I think, is at the state level and local level, where also these state governments just don't have the capacity to really move money that quickly, and and they're challenged by figuring out which of these new federal programs to apply for, the grants, because a lot of these programs are grant programs. So there's sort of a big scramble, and it's a real challenge to do it and do it well. And I think that's going to be really what we're going to be working on for the next many years. It's exciting, but it's a challenge. Jonathan?
Thank you. I'm looking forward to talking with you some more about this. These are great topics. So I'm looking forward to our discussions. So I'm Jonathan Rubin. I'm a professor of economics at the University of Maine. So one thing I'd like to really talk about a little bit is charging. Charging infrastructure is not adequate. I don't know if anybody out in the audience has an electric vehicle or friends with an electric vehicle, but the charging is far less than we need. Especially, you have to recognize we're still in the very early stages. Canada is about, what, 7% EVs right now, about national, about sales on average. When we get to the next group of people who are going to be buying these vehicles, not the enthusiasts, but the people who just say, is it a good car, is it a good value, can I use it? Charging is a big deal. People do not want to have to worry about charging. And not only, so when I want to talk about charging, there's urban charging and then there's rural charging, right? Canada and or my state of Maine are very rural. Of course, you have Quebec City here, which is such a lovely place, but urban parts of Canada non-urban parts of Canada and Quebec and rural parts of America, this is really a challenge getting across it. And if you say, well, it's not such a big deal, most people live in cities, but people who live in cities want to go to rural areas to vacation or to travel, and that is enough to stop someone from buying a vehicle. So we have to solve that. But the problem here is the business model, because if you're not using chargers fully, then you aren't going to be able to pay for them because it's still quite expensive. Not just the chargers per se, but it's all the electrical work to make them connected to the grid, ripping up sidewalks, ripping up driveways, fixing them. So that's very, very expensive, and we're a long way from that. And so I personally feel that some of this, notwithstanding the $10 billion, I still think we need more for charging, especially in rural areas. And then, again, talking a little bit about the business model for charging, right now, you need separate phone apps, essentially, depending upon where you charge. So Quebec has its own charging system. There's 3 or 4 in the United States. There's one in New Brunswick. You have to have different apps. Tesla is the exception. Tesla has an excellent charging system across the United States and Canada. But it's still really a problem about this issue about having to have different apps. Can you imagine going to your gasoline station and saying, well, you don't have a mobile card, therefore you can't fill up your car today? I mean, we don't allow that, but that's effectively what it is right now for EV charging. It's really a problem. And then there's huge equity issues. The current subsidy systems really favor the better off. And that is a public policy issue that I think needs more discussion about whether or not we really ought to be taking these subsidies. Now, the subsidies don't say, oh, you can only go to wealthy people, but who buys new cars? 2/3 of all car sales in a given year are used, 1/3 are new, and if you look at who new car buyers are, they're wealthier, more highly educated. So the subsidies, in effect, are going to wealthier people, higher educated people, and you have to say to yourself, is that a good use of public dollars to be giving that group a beautiful, luxury, nice car? I mean, electric vehicles are wonderful. Anybody who's driven one says, oh, this is really nice. But where are the subsidies going? And so I think that's a real issue, and we didn't talk about you mentioned transit a bit, but rural transit is really a challenge. Again, how do you move people who live in a rural area need to go to medical appointments, they may not have a car, they need to go to education. That is still really a problem, and so figuring out that rural transit business case and providing mobility is still, I don't think we have good answers for those, and I'll stop at that.
Thank you. Lou?
Yep. Okay, more wood on the fire there. Thank you, Jonathan. I mean, so you talked about some specific policies, and you talked about some specific challenges that need policies, and I'll see if I can just kind of pull it together. I mean, so we're supposed to be talking about policy research, and so it's about what do we do to figure out how to, effectively develop policies to solve the various kinds of challenges that we're facing. And these challenges are happening very quickly now because we are in a period of very rapid transition. And so, I mean, it all kind of comes from, we know that the imperatives, the climate imperatives that we need to, as a, relatively wealthy countries, the US and Canada, we are committed to trying to get as close to net zero as we can by 2050. To get there, we would like to transition new sales to the extent possible by, let's say, 2035, and in fact, provinces like Quebec, BC, are mandating that there will only be electric vehicles or plug-in vehicles sold from 2035 on. In the United States, California and a number of other states are also making that commitment, and maybe more states will join that. Maybe eventually there will be a national target, and maybe in Canada there will be a national target. But that's only 13 years from now, and we're starting to throw policies on the table to try to make this happen, because having a target isn't enough by itself. It's very nice. It's actually very critical to have targets. I think we've learned this. It gets everybody on the same page and realizing the imperative and the urgency. But now we're trying to figure out, what kinds of policies are the policies that we are implementing enough? Do they cover all of the different situations, for example? And it's not only about electric vehicles, but we'll run with that example here. As Jonathan mentions, you have a wide range of customers out there. Even just looking at new car buyers, we're only in the first 10% of buyers, and that's sort of your dream group who want to buy these vehicles. What about the next 10%, the next 10%? We still don't really know that much about these consumer groups and what it's going to take for them to step up. And we're talking about trying to get all the way to the last 10%, in the next 13 years. So we need a lot more research on these consumer groups. We also need research on how we make sure that the manufacturers come forward with the product, that we have choices and we have enough supply of vehicles. And I mean, to their credit, the curves are very steep, and the amount of investment that will be needed is great. It'll be in the hundreds of billions of dollars over 10 years, highly risky investments that we're asking companies to make. So I personally think that the incentives, they could be better, and they probably are too much targeted to the wealthy, and we could do better there, but we probably are going to need strong incentives to bring down the cost of these vehicles. We're going to need that infrastructure. We've got these ZEV mandates in some places. I mean, that sounds great. Are they enough, or are they not enough? I mean, California's had ZEV mandates for 30 years. 2 waves of them failed, and now this time it's looking better. We're going to probably be able to hit our 2025 target of about 18% electric vehicle sales, although some people may not agree with that. Right now we're at about 7%. No, excuse me. In California we are around 13%. So we're getting there. But again, what happens, after 2025, and maybe we still won't have enough if we have incentives, if we have a big program to put in infrastructure, and even with manufacturer requirements. Is that enough? And so I think there's a huge amount of policy research that needs to be done. And finally, we're starting to align these policies. Quebec and California are fairly aligned, at least on ZEVs, and quite a few provinces, and now the country of Canada has something like a low carbon fuel standard. Canada's got the clean fuel standard. In fact, we're about to publish a paper that compares these. We're getting some alignment, but the more that the states and the provinces can align on these things, the much stronger will be these set of policies. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. Mark Winfield should still be coming, and just maybe take up a bit of time. Maybe I'll give just a bit of background on the JCCTRP, because I sort of didn't give you enough of the details there at the start. So this is a research partnership that we've been undertaking since at least 2018, and we've been very fortunate to have initiated it as a research partnership between researchers here in Quebec, Ontario, but also California and New England, especially the state of Vermont, and also I think we've had the Georgetown Climate Center as a long-term partner. And so now we're looking to expand this research partnership into other states and provinces in Canada, and we're hoping that Maine will be a partner moving forward, and we're also looking into Western Canada, BC and Alberta, and maybe some other parts of the US as well as we move forward. But what we're really trying to do with this research partnership is bring together experts, researchers who have that technical expertise, comfortable throwing numbers around, and also able to use very sophisticated modeling tools that exist out there for understanding the technical and economic potential for different decarbonization pathways in the transportation sector. And so we're really happy to have partners with that level of expertise in all these jurisdictions. But we're trying to marry that technical expertise with policy research and policy expertise, especially in a comparative perspective. So we see some really interesting synergies and differences between jurisdictions, which, so an example synergy, I think Lou has mentioned the zero emission vehicle mandate, the ZEV mandate that's been kind of, that Quebec has taken a certain inspiration from California and its development of that policy instrument. Most recently, we have the clean fuel regulations, which the Canadian federal government adopted just this summer, which is very much inspired by a low carbon fuel standard in California. And maybe another one we can mention is the carbon market linking California and Quebec. And so we've been building some expertise around these three areas, so policy instruments and at the jurisdictional level, but also some looking at urban transport planning and efforts to decarbonize cities as well. So looking at different levels of governance trying to bring together modelers and policy experts together. And when we seek more funding, we're hoping that we'll be able to expand this research and really do some more participatory research and really kind of get to issues, developing tools that members of the public can use and that really address issues that people in certain jurisdictions really want answers on. So how quickly can we ramp up ZEVs here in Quebec, and is that going to be the same in British Columbia? What does that mean for supply chains? And so there's a lot of questions, and the devil's sort of in the details, and we have really a great team in all these jurisdictions to examine this. So maybe with that said, I'll turn to what we're going to do. I think Professor Winfield is en route, and so we'll give him the floor when he arrives. But we have some questions prepared, and we'll just sort of, I'll ask the questions and let our panelists respond. We'll do that for maybe 15 or 20 minutes, and then we're going to open the floor here to the participants here and see if you have questions. And I'm sure our panelists will be happy to engage with you on those issues. So, if I could start with the first question, and this is maybe just to reiterate, transportation, the largest source of emissions in most most U.S. states and Canadian provinces. Why has it proven so difficult to reduce emissions in the transportation sector? And maybe I'll just, James, you can start, and then you can kind of hand it down.
I'm happy to start, and you may have noticed in the slide I showed of the projected emissions and from our modeling, is I had to really zoom in, right, on that declining trajectory from business as usual to show you the difference from that, either maybe emissions going up a little bit or maybe emissions going down a little bit, but it was less than 2% over the course of the next decade or so. So why is that so hard? And again, remember, that's putting $600 billion into investments in transportation. So it is really hard to move the needle. It's really hard to change the emissions trajectory. I think one of the big reasons is the way that we have built our infrastructure in the U.S. is really around the automobile. And so the land use decisions that we've made in the past really lock in emissions of the future. And so when you're in a hole, stop digging. That's an expression in the United States. And that's my view on sort of the policy solutions, is stop building and expanding highways. Sorry to keep beating that drum, but that's a really big challenge in the US, and I'm sure here in Canada as well, particularly where a lot of the hubs where people live and towns are pretty spread out. So how do you make it attractive for people to live in more dense areas, closer by to their neighbors, where biking and walking and really get what you need to get done, or just even short trips in an electric car. So how can you make that more appealing so that people want to live in places like that?
Lou?
Yeah, those are great points. I mean, you can sort of break it down. I think you have a question coming up on this in terms of, the role of how we travel, what travel choices we make, and then if you're in a vehicle, what vehicle choices we make. And there's probably a third pillar, but I'll let you get back to that. But on the vehicle side, if you look at either Canada or the US, I mean, actually, I think Canada might now have the biggest light-duty vehicles in the world. I think you guys are the highest SUV share. I think you've even passed the US. So go Canada.
You like your big trucks.
Well, I mean, and it's just like, 76% compared to 74%. And, this is countries that 20 years ago, it was probably, 2/3, 1/3 what we call cars compared to SUVs and pickup trucks, right? They were 1/3, now they're 2/3 or more. Like, actually, it is, I think, around 75%. It's because that's what people want. Okay, and in fact, if you look at the fuel economy standards that both countries have had, corporate average fuel economy in US, corporate average fuel consumption in Canada, they've managed to keep fuel use from going up per vehicle, but they haven't really made it go down that much. And instead, the manufacturers just keep making them bigger and heavier while meeting that constraint. So ultimately, it comes down to the fact that people just have wanted to have bigger, faster vehicles, and they've been enabled to do that. And you could argue that they should be enabled to do that. But ultimately, at some point, we're not going to reduce CO2 emissions. And what we finally basically have done is say, okay, we're just going to shift to electric vehicles and clean up the electric sector, and then they can still be big. All that means is we're going to use a lot of electricity and have a lot of batteries in these cars. But, I mean, that's the kind of reason that it's been very difficult to reduce emissions.
Jonathan.
So, Lou, I concur with you, but I think, why though? I mean, we are getting wealthier. Canada and the United States, our gross domestic products are growing. And if cars and private transportation are a normal good, like any other good we consume, as we get wealthier, we consume more of it. Mobility and private car transport is highly correlated with income. If you look at income quintiles and how much people drive, it's very strongly correlated with income. So they are driving, we drive more, we fly more, we do all sorts of things more as we get wealthier, and as Lou correctly pointed out, we're buying vehicles with faster acceleration and bigger that use more energy per mile. Plus the obvious fact, Canada is a huge, lovely country, as is the United States. It's different in Europe It's different in Japan. We have our physical form of our country. We should not forget, just makes this very challenging for any type of cross-country travel. Thank you.
Okay, well, I'm going to pause the Q&A session because we're fortunate to have Professor Winfield from York University with us, who has made a tremendous effort to be with us, so we really do appreciate that. I think maybe I'll just reread his biography real quick. He's professor of environmental and urban change at York University. He's also co-chair of the faculty's Sustainable Energy Initiative and coordinator of the Joint Master of Environmental Studies and JD program offered in conjunction with Osgoode Hall Law School. He's published a number of articles, book chapters and reports, had a number of official positions with the government of Ontario, the federal Canadian government, as well as at Transition Énergétique Québec. And I believe maybe you can confirm the status of the Sustainable Energy Transitions for Canada, Opportunities and Challenges book. Is that?
Going to the UBC press board on next Friday.
Okay.
So then we will be impressed.
Well,
So
congrats.
We're very close.
Anyway, Professor Winfield, the floor is yours.
Oh, all right.
They asked us to use the mic so that
Okay.
it's
so
for
they get
recording.
the audio.
Yeah.
So I've had my own adventures with transportation today. It might have been better to Zoom. I'm only here an hour later than I planned on. So I'll make some quick remarks just because I'll throw them out there. Mostly sort of on the situation in Ontario and sort of comparing it with Quebec and also California and U.S. states. So this is picking up on themes that were in the paper that Mark and I did a little while ago. And just sort of some broad observations of sort of where we're at. And I think it kind of highlights some of the difference between the United States and Canada in this regard, in the sense of particularly, in some ways, certain things are very flipped. That in our case, we have very, very weak federal role, at least as it relates to transportation and especially land use. The federal interventions are mostly in the form at the moment of subsidization of electric vehicle purchasing and charging infrastructure. There is no tie really between federal funding of infrastructure at the provincial level, particularly transportation infrastructure, and climate policies or air quality policies as you see in the United States. So there's no MPOs, there's no requirements similar to what you would find in the Clean Air Act. Basically, federal funding is ad hoc. There's a little bit of a qualification on that, but mostly ad hoc and mostly in response to provincially determined priorities. Sort of flip the other side to the provincial side. Again, it is somewhat opposite, particularly relative to California, in the sense that provinces have actually very powerful authority vis-a-vis land use planning. This is a product of a constitutional structure where municipalities are seen as creatures of the province. They have no constitutional status of their own, a point reinforced by our Supreme Court about a year ago in litigation involving the City of Toronto. They're rather emphatic that I believe the words were that the province can do, in this case with the City of Toronto, as it pleases. And it has done so on multiple occasions. So we don't see a lot of very explicit use of modeling at the provincial level in transportation planning, in part because there is no demand, really. That transportation planning, especially transit, but you could argue highways as well, has become profoundly politicized. That there is virtually no oversight in Quebec. The situation is somewhat better than Ontario in the sense that at least the Treasury Board requires some evidence base for investmts. In Ontario, we don't have that. The extent to which sometimes it seems we have policy-based evidence rather than evidence-based policy. That, as I say, transit priorities have been deeply politicized, very strongly controlled by the province. In some cases, we have seen sort of modeling used as an ex post facto justification for political decisions, not the other way around. Although strangely, in a sense, the province has become more muscular than ever, especially in terms of its land use planning powers, and particularly since 2018, has been very willing to override municipal planning decisions. The problem is these have less, I'm afraid, to do with the optimization of transportation considerations, and I fear more to do with the interests of the development industry. But that's very much where we seem to have landed. As I say, it's a flip relative to the U.S. in the sense that you have a very weak federal role, fundamentally following the provincial lead, and at the same, also, at least relative to California, you do have this possibility that the provinces have potentially very strong tools at their disposal in terms of land use planning. There is no Proposition 13, there is no takings clause. There were very deliberate decisions last time we rewrote the Constitution 40 years ago that we were not putting property rights in. The problem has been utilizing those tools effectively from an urban design and transportation demand management perspective has been where things have broken down. So that's probably my 2 cents on all of this, which hopefully contributes somewhat to the conversation, having dropped into it. Someone parachuted into the conversation.
No, it fits well.
Yeah.
It's like, why don't we have the right policies?
Well,
right?
this is part of the answer. I mean, I think where Mark and I have been thinking, I mean, there is considerable potential for the federal government to play a more assertive role if it wants to. So far, it has chosen not to, especially around transportation and transit. It very much follows the provincial lead. So if it wanted to conditionalize funding in some way on climate performance, there's nothing that stops it from doing that. It's just a question of, is it willing to do it? There is a climate test sort of being built into certain funding decisions, but so far, we don't see any evidence at all of that having any impact on anything the provinces are doing. So it is so in a sense, the comparative analysis works very well, and shows some very strong contrasts in sort of the environments in which subnational governments are working and the cards in effect that they hold. California has both the backup from the federal side, but has also made the decisions to link the air quality and climate elements of its strategies, but is handcuffed on the land use side. Yeah. We're somewhat the opposite, since we could do a great deal on the land use side, but so far there have been earlier attempts to do that. At the moment, we're not in a good space that way, would be my basic summary.
Well, and an interesting thing about in the U.S., I mean, if you look at the highway transportation bills, the federal transportation bills, and pretty much the way the states spend their money, they aren't solving for climate. They aren't solving for reducing emissions unless they're in a place like California where you're already exceeding these, these air quality limits. If you're in violation of these Clean Air Act limits, then you do have to solve for reducing those emissions. But that's a small part of the, those are not the majority of the country at all. They're solving for safety, congestion relief, and so they're not, that's just not part of the culture. It's not really in the DNA. It's not in the mission of the, every government agency has a mission. That's not part of it, is reducing carbon emissions. So California and a few other states have.
Well, plus we just went through 4 years until the 2020 election, where nationally you weren't even allowed to use the word climate. So that had an impact, even,
Yeah, the politics has gotten really tricky. So it is up to the states really to, on their own, like California has to make it part of the mission of, and make the transportation planners solve for reducing emissions. But that's, and it's been challenging, and they've had, SB 375 has been around for a while now.
Yeah, 10 years.
10 years.
SB 375 is a California law that directs communities to lower the travel, the VMT, vehicles miles of travel, by a certain amount. It's supposed to be 10% reduction between 2010 and 2020, and very few, locations have achieved anything like that. It's been a failure, basically.
And that was, the legislature passed it. They said, you've got a plan for this, and they couldn't do it. So it comes back to the first question you asked, Mark, is, boy, why is it so hard to reduce emissions from this sector? And we're still learning, but thank God California is leading, so there is a lot to learn.
Not leading on everything, but on some things.
On that attempted policy.
Yeah. And incidentally, just on talking about California and the federal system in the United States, it's all based on a clause in the Clean Air Act, I think in the amendments, which incidentally go back to 1969, which is, so it's 50 years of precedent here. I might remind the Supreme Court, because I'm sure it's going to come up to the Supreme Court, but the last administration tried to get rid of the waiver that allows California to set more stringent standards than the nation. And that went into lawsuits, and then we had, a new administration come in and they've wiped that out. But that'll happen again. If Republicans, take back the White House, they're going to do that again. So that's the cycling that goes on in the United States that I think maybe you don't have quite that much whiplash going on in Canada.
We have at the provincial level.
Okay.
We have not federally. And of course, we have now made someone leader of Her Majesty's official opposition as of last weekend, who could very definitely give us that kind of a whipsaw. I mean, that's not until 2024, 25 that we'd face a federal election, but there's a very real possibility that what we saw happen in Ontario at the provincial level in 2018, when a relatively comprehensive strategy around climate, including participation in the California-Quebec cap and trade system, was quite literally wiped out overnight within virtually the first month of the arrival of the new administration. So it's not impossible. We've had a period of relative stability federally, but now that, I was telling my class, last week that, 4 years ago I would have said to you, we were over the hump. That we were at a point of political consensus, that we had governments in most of the provinces and federal level, and leadership even in eventually the Conservative Party, but certain provincial Conservative parties too, essentially accepted carbon pricing of some sort, accepted that climate change was real, that we're into a conversation of the details of how do we do this. And now we're in an environment of extremely high political risk again, that instead of being over the hill and sort of starting down the downside, we're back into a position where the whole thing federally could disappear overnight. Not that dissimilar from what happened in the United States. I mean, we don't know where we're going to be, I say, 2 to 3 years from now in terms of a federal election. But that risk is now back in the mix in a way that 4 years ago, I just said, no, we're done that. We're into the details of how we're going to do this. And we're fighting over the finer points of designing carbon pricing regimes and things.
Yeah, another way that U.S. and Canada are similar, I guess.
Yeah, on this one I would love to be able to say we're the model of stability, but we've made some choices recently for reasons I think largely unconnected to climate change, to much larger traditions, political and economic structural transitions, but which have introduced a populist streak into our politics. And how that plays is very much an open question now.
You want me to throw in another question here?
Sure.
So, the title of our talk, we're looking at advancing research. What are some of the key research priorities for climate and transportation policy? And maybe, Jonathan, we could start on you and work our way over.
Well, I mean, there's a whole bunch of questions. It's a big question, but I'll take one. There's a lot of question about whether or not we can transition to a hydrogen economy to make the economic case for some of the provinces, such as Alberta, Saskatchewan, and parts of the United States, Louisiana, others, that have a very big petroleum sectors. And to avoid that pushback and the political whiplash as we're talking about, can hydrogen, what are we still don't really know the economic feasibility of various types of hydrogen pathways, including sequestration pathways, including pipeline or trucking, and the industrial policy to get there. So I think that's an open question right now about whether or not hydrogen is going to be feasible for these petroleum intensive areas of our two countries, such that they have a viable path to maintain their business model, but clean it up and provide this really great fuel, hydrogen, at a cost that is possibly affordable. So that's just one. We could have an entire conference on hydrogen pathways, but that's one research question. And again, another really is, I think, thinking about, as I mentioned earlier in my introductory comments, which is how do we provide transit in rural areas, not urban areas? Urban transit's challenging, but transit and mobility options in rural areas. What's the business case to get smaller vans dispatched as needed that can serve people's needs? It's really not clear, again, how we build that out so that there are viable options. I'll stop with two.
Yeah, those are good and specific, so I'll try to stay specific. I think we might want to talk about low carbon fuels, biofuels, something like that, but the one I feel like mentioning now, we've touched on it, but back to electric vehicles, we are marching down a path toward hopefully 100% sales of, it could include hydrogen vehicles, but let's say that it's mostly, or probably almost all, going to be electric vehicles and plug-in hybrids by 2035. We are really betting that consumers will go along with this, and also that manufacturers are going to be able to keep up and that they're going to be all in. And in a sense, what we're hoping for is a tipping point where it just happens, so that you get to whatever it is, 20-30% market share, and you just see the dominoes start to fall. And by the time you're at 70% market share, you'd like to believe that people are shutting gasoline fuel stations all over the place, and consumers are like, okay, fine, I give up, I'm going to buy an electric vehicle, and it just completes itself. But we don't really know that. You'd like to believe it's like iPhones or something, or smartphones, or CDs, right? I mean, those things that did happen, they had such a clear, superior performance over, or maybe there wasn't much before that. It's not clear when and how that's going to happen with electric vehicles, and there is a risk that we're going to push this rock uphill for a very long time. So the better we can understand when we might achieve a tipping point, and the better we can understand how consumers are going to behave, not just the first 10%, and also how manufacturers are going to behave, and at what point are they all in. And I think it's actually maybe fairly close with a lot of the manufacturers, the amount of money they're now putting toward electric vehicles. I'm beginning to believe it. And you're seeing advertisements for electric vehicles way more than you did 2 years ago. These are good signs, because I think if the big OEMs end up kind of getting to the point of no return, that may push us very well, because they're not going to let presidents take us back the other way. They're going to try not to. But we still need to study this and figure out how long do we have to pay for all this to happen before it can just be self-sustaining?
I'm going to take it a slightly different direction, and I'm thinking about it from a policymaker perspective, and the departments of transportation at the state level and at the provisional level, and what is it going to take for them to choose to invest and prioritize their investments toward low carbon solutions, and to get that into more in their repertoire. What are the tools that will enable them to do that more readily? Right now they have tools that help them solve for safety and congestion. What information do they need to prioritize low carbon options? And in the process of that, something that maybe is a bit more on the research side, some states are, for the political reasons we were discussing earlier, are going to be really reluctant to do that, and it's going to take way too long. So maybe some research could be which types of, I don't know, how can you solve for safety and congestion reduction and quietly for climate in ways that they don't realize. And you can, I don't know, I'm not really saying that in the right way.
Get synergies.
Yeah, where are the synergies with safety and congestion relief that are also low carbon, that will and provide all DOTs with tools that really solve for those synergies.
Well, I mean, there's a lot there. The hydrogen one is huge. And the pathway that's emerging in Western Canada is, of course, very, very blue hydrogen, very CCUS dependent, if that's where they're going to go. I mean, there is an idea we're going to have a giant wind farm on the shore of Newfoundland, and it's going to be making ammonia. Or they'll use hydrogen to make ammonia, or use the wind turbines to make the hydrogen, which they will then turn into ammonia, so then they can put it on the tankers to send off to Europe.
Is that a firmed up project, or is that just
No,
a proposal?
that's the one they dreamed up while the German Chancellor was here last week. Because
yeah.
they came to the realization liquid natural gas was not going to happen, because the natural gas pipeline network stops about Quebec City.
Plus, now hydrogen is preferable to natural gas as a thing to talk about.
Yes,
so.
it is. Although the natural gas industry are very keen about hydrogen in Canada, because they see that as their salvation. And the nuclear industry is very keen as well. But to come back to research agendas, the one that's got a lot of attention, one is, yes, this interesting question that the manufacturers are going in the direction of electrification. It seems very strong. Indeed, they've strong-armed our provincial government into giving them quite a lot of money to retool the automobile manufacturing sector in Ontario to make EVs. There's a question about consumer acceptance, particularly with rural populations, where, among other things, here EVs don't work so well. Because batteries, the battery sensitivity to cold is a non-trivial question when you're a long way away and your charging infrastructure is not very present. But the other big question that's starting to emerge now is around electrification pathways. Like what happens in terms of electricity systems, and if we're talking about full-scale electrification of transport, what does that mean in terms of electricity supply? What does it mean at the level of distribution networks? Like, we have a lot of local utilities who are freaking out at the possibilities of EV charging loads on distribution networks, which were absolutely never designed. They're designed to maybe run a dryer once a week, not, carry those sorts of charging loads. And bidirectional will just cause them to keel over completely. I mean, in fairness, they are thinking about it very seriously. But they're also thinking about the scale of the infrastructure investments necessary to make it work. I mean, the engineers are coming around. We think we know how to make it work, but it's going to require reconstructing the distribution networks and the control systems and everything else to make that work. So that one's sitting out there. And then where would you go in terms of electricity supply? Is it going to be largely distributed? Is it big centralized supply? Is at this stage an unknown and something utilities aren't necessarily thinking about that much even yet? So those are a couple of big ones. I'd say that there's a political acceptance question still looming out there. In some ways the train seems to have left the station, and it seems to be an EV train. Less high hydrogen where it fits is less clear altogether. But then also, as you get into the weeds of what does this really look like as a build out and a play out, that one is not thought through very well at all by anybody. Yeah. We've only in the last, when did Madeline do it? Was it 2 months ago was the first time we saw someone using relatively sophisticated electricity system models trying to think about what would this look like. Up to this stage, we've had sort of relatively econometric models to give you very high level sort of answers about what they think would happen with electricity demand, have no answers on, well, how would you actually meet this demand and how would you make that system work?
So I'm going to ask one last question. And, well, you can respond as you see fit. Where do greater opportunities for climate cooperation between the U.S. and Canada lie, particularly with Quebec? Jonathan,
So
why don't we start?
I'll start. As a state of Maine, I don't know if folks here paid attention, but they were trying to have the Clean Energy Connect, a high-powered transmission from Hydro-Quebec through Maine over to Massachusetts. That is still a possible reality, as the Maine Supreme Court has thrown it back to a district court to rule on whether or not I'm not a lawyer, but sort of standing, have they invested enough to have property rights for that to go forward? We should know pretty soon, but this, as Mark pointed out, how we transmit clean electricity around the country and around regions is still not clear. But there's a clear case now between Quebec and Maine or the East Coast, and how we do those interconnects and how we share the benefits of that. And I think one reason it failed within the state of Maine the first time through a referendum was that communication of the benefits to Maine in particular were not clear. It was clear why Massachusetts was going to gain, and it was clear why Quebec was going to gain, but it wasn't clear to the citizens of Maine why we were going to get our trees cut down for other people. Now, I think it's a good case, but I'm saying that that is still to be done, but that is an area of cooperation.
Is this really your last question?
Yeah, and then we'll open it up to
Oh,
the
yeah,
floor.
that's true. So I had some other ones, like Jonathan's got, it was a nice specific one, but maybe I'll take the opportunity to try to bring it back to kind of the theme of what this group does together, which is policy research on transportation and energy and sustainability. And so when you think about greater opportunities for cooperation between the U.S. and Canada, I mean, we've got some pretty good cooperation right here with people like us, all academics, and doing modeling and other kinds of analysis of these questions. I think we need to get that modeling and get that analysis more in front of policymakers, and hopefully they would pay more attention to it. I think, Mark, you said that we've got policy driving modeling instead of the other way around, but I mean, it's hard. It's hard. I mean, there's all kinds of pressures on policymakers, and a modeler comes along to tell you, here's what I found, and we'll see, if we can ever have a huge impact. In California, it really feeds into the process. It's amazing. And the agencies have very strong modeling capabilities themselves. But as an example for where I think we could increase the cooperation is low carbon fuels, and I think we can do it on any number of things. Low carbon fuels, meaning biofuels, maybe eventually what we call e-fuels, where you're generating liquid fuels from solar and through a series of processes. We are going to need a lot of very low net carbon liquid fuels for ships, for aircraft, maybe for trucks for a long time. Even cars, the last internal combustion engine car ain't going to be off the road until at least 2050, probably later. So we need to transform the liquid fuel system from a petroleum system to a near net zero carbon system. We've got California with a low carbon fuel standard. You've got Quebec and BC with similar systems. Now California has a clean fuel standard. The US has its renewable fuel standard, totally different system. None of these systems are exactly the same. In fact, we have a paper coming out about how they're different. And ultimately, I think it's going to be a big help that Canada puts its clean fuel standard in place, because Canada's got about the same amount of fuel demand as California, so it doubles the impact of the California one. But until you get even bigger markets like the United States on the same page, a lot of what you're doing is moving fuel around. So the cleaner fuels will go to the markets demanding the cleaner fuels, and that means dirtier fuels can be sent to the other markets. And that's even a global problem. But at least for U.S. and California, we have a shot at now kind of having a combined two-country policy on clean fuels that's aligned and really has a big impact on what is going into our gasoline vehicles eventually. And hopefully it's sustainable and it's not all based on soybeans turning into a renewable fuel or a clean jet fuel. And it's going to take a lot of work to get to truly sustainable liquid fuels. But I think a cooperation on both policy and on the research that can inform policy is critical here.
Great. I'll be brief. I think vehicle manufacturing could be an interesting area in the new Inflation Reduction Act that the President Biden just signed. There are these incentives for electric vehicles that I mentioned. What I didn't mention is that there are domestic content requirements in those built into those incentives that increase over time, including that the batteries be manufactured in the U.S. or sourced in the U.S. or with a trading partner. So that would include Canada and also the manufacturing. Could that also be in Canada, I think, or is it just the source of the materials?
No, anything. I think it's a free trade zone.
We're
going to hear the giant sucking sound of everything going to Canada now.
Well, well, it's better than what happened with tar sands. So anyway, I think I'll stop with that. I think that's an interesting opportunity for both countries to build domestic manufacturing for electric vehicles.
Mark, final word?
I think they're cross. I mean, there's all kinds of interesting dynamics here because, of course, Ontario would like hydro. Well, parts of Ontario would like Quebec's hydro surplus too, because we're on track to a 600% increase in electricity sector-related greenhouse gas emissions. Because we have a large nuke plant that has to retire. Should have retired 6 years ago, and we have the other two which have to be refurbished and rebuilt. And so we are on track to a massive increase in gas-fired generation. Some of us have tried to convince the province to have a conversation with the other side of the Ottawa River, which so far it's been surprisingly reluctant to do. But there's a complication in that mix. I think the auto sector, it seems, as I say, the industry itself seems to have sort of made this decision that this is where it's going, and that we're seeing big investments in the manufacturing capacity on the Canadian side. As you know, that's something Canada actually fought for quite hard to make sure we didn't get excluded from the Buy America provisions, and the level of integration in the sector that already exists. You know, the unions will always remind you that parts go back and forth across the border 18 times in the construction of a vehicle in the Great Lakes Basin. The other one for Quebec, especially, is around batteries and around. And there's a long history of research on batteries in Quebec through Hydro-Quebec. There seems to be an emergent strategy in Quebec around battery manufacturing, but also recycling. And then there's a more complicated set of relationships emerging around this thing called critical minerals, which the government of Canada seems to be very enthusiastically embracing its role as a supplier of critical minerals, and doesn't necessarily have thought about that there could be some significant trade-offs and complications there involving Indigenous people and other things. And it's not clear how much, I mean, there's now a great deal of discussion about supply chains, but how much our role is to be the diggers of the rocks as opposed to the value-added producers. I mean, we just signed a deal with Volkswagen, which seems to say, well, instead of beaver pelts, now we're going to do critical minerals, but it's the same basic model. Instead of beaver hats, they'll be selling Volkswagens back to us. So that one is still there, and how the Canada-US relationship will work around that is unclear. It may be a derivative of what happens in the auto sector. So there's lots of cross-border possibilities here going on, given the level of integration, especially in the vehicle manufacturing sector, that's essentially a single industry. And so far Canada's been successful in holding on to that, but it was very interesting. It was not the government of Ontario. It was the auto manufacturers told the province, this is what you're going to do if you're going to retain manufacturing in Ontario. This was a government that had completely dismantled the entire framework around EVs and said didn't like them. It was in a lawsuit with Tesla. Actually lost to Elon Musk in that one. But was told by the manufacturers, this is what you're going to do. And this is how much money you're going to be giving us. Which in its own way I take as a good, sort of a signal from the sector.
If we happen to,
They've made their move.
if we happen
you're
to
gonna follow.
agree with what they want,
Yeah,
then we think it's great, right?
It's great. It's great.
was
At
gonna
a
say,
at a very
fringe.
high level, it's that they seem to be committing to a transition in the vehicle fleet. The details are a whole other question, and neither the province nor the federal government, I think, asked that much before they handed over about $2 billion on the first pass. And some of the manufacturers haven't got their bids in yet in terms of how much they would like. But one would expect the answer will be, yep, there you go. As much as if that's what it takes to keep manufacturing in Ontario, that's what we'll do, I think is what will happen.
Okay, well, thank you for those responses. We have about 10 minutes left, so I wanted to open up the questions to the floor. So, si vous avez des questions en français, vous pouvez les poser en français ou pour faire la traduction. Je vais aussi juste noter qu'on on va avoir un cocktail.
Don't
Puis
mention
on a-
that yet.
Et on a déjà pas mal de pizzas disponibles pour les étudiants, les autres qui sont veulent chercher un peu faim. So I'm just flagging we have a cocktail, so you don't have to rush off because we actually need the food and alcohol to be consumed as much as possible. So I think there is one question over here, and I'll just walk around and hand it off.
So use the mic,
Yeah, we have the video, so
and maybe people can introduce themselves?
Okay, so hello everyone, and my name is Nina, and I'm here exchange student from Europe, from Poland. So I was interested how you are looking for generally climate and transportation, and you were talking a lot about electric vehicles, electric cars, and I Google it and researched that generally energy mix in United States of America in 2019, renewable energy took 11% and nuclear one 8%. So it's less than 20% of energy which those electric vehicles can use. So I'm wondering what is done or will be done in the future to higher this energy mix to make them actually net zero in the future. Or another question, why in these conditions not invest also in public transport when I personally see a lot of room for improvement? And another question about those electric vehicles, what about the batteries? Because generally still we don't know how to, I lost my word in English, but how to get rid of them after the use and what to do. And are there any research done for those batteries not to have problem in future? Yeah, thank you.
That's a lot of questions.
Three good questions, and I think it was just how to dispose of the batteries. Yeah.
Well, I'll start briefly. Certainly in the United States, as I think I mentioned, the Inflation Reduction Act includes huge incentives to promote low-carbon electricity generation, wind, solar, and other low-carbon technologies, geothermal, and it's a very generous subsidy, and it goes for 10 years. And it's even set up that if we don't get to 75% renewable energy by then the incentives persist and continue. So it's a very important long-term policy. All of the modeling that's been done by different research organizations have found that it's going to really make a big difference on reducing emissions from the grid. So that's the biggest feature of the Inflation Reduction Act. The other main feature of it is there are tax incentives, grant programs, and so a lot of money that's going into domestic manufacturing of clean technologies, including batteries. And so I think that speaks in part to your other question about
Let me just add
batteries.
one more
Yeah,
point to
please
that
go
one.
ahead.
You got to remember, too, that, so if you're worried about the fact that we've got electric vehicles operating on not such clean electricity right now, and then you hear that plan, assuming it doesn't get, it stays on track, even if we had 50% sales of electric vehicles by 2030, which is what Biden would like, but there's actually no clear, legal directive to that. But even if we achieve 50%, it's still only 20 to 25% at the stock share. Only, a quarter of all the cars and light-duty vehicles would be electric. So it's still kind of early days in 2030 for the vehicles, and we have a chance to have the grid, ahead of the vehicles, actually. It's not like the grid's behind the vehicles. It's ahead of them.
Yeah. Yeah, well, those are, I think others maybe could speak to, there was the transit,
Because I think that having electric vehicles will still make us, the consumers, buy vehicles and make the need for new cars, etc., new products, let's say. When we'll invest in public transport, I think it will reduce the need for buying cars and having all their own transport, let's say. So, I'm just wondering why not to invest more also in this public transport.
well, there are a lot of good reasons to invest in public transport that aren't just about reducing emissions. Certainly from an equity standpoint, you provide people who can't drive or can't afford to drive with an opportunity to have access to opportunity, whether that's a job or public health, health care, or just going shopping, whatever you need to do. And so I think there are a lot of good reasons to invest in transit, and I think even just keeping the transit system running well, the existing transit system, it's really important to maintain, because you need to keep riders on those trains, paying those fares. If you're not investing in the transit system, people will walk away from it.
But
So
she's wondering why we don't grow it more.
why don't we? Well, I don't have a good answer for that. I think it's a question of public dollars. It's not cheap. It's a lot of money.
Yeah, I completely concur with the benefits of public transit especially for those that can't or don't want to drive a personal vehicle. But the emission reductions from public transit are somewhat limited.
Yeah.
In the sense that if you just look at where the emissions are from, you really need to reduce the emissions of the light-duty vehicles. It's just where the biggest bang is. It's not that public transit isn't important, but it's not as important from a greenhouse gas perspective.
Yeah.
And then on your final question about batteries, the question was, what about recycling and reuse of these batteries? It's a real issue, but it's not. First of all, I'm not to dismiss the question, but I'm not too worried because there's a lot of valuable material in those even used batteries. I don't foresee where you'd ever landfill them because the lithium is still lithium and the cobalt's still cobalt, but how we recycle them we don't know yet because the chemistries are different and they're changing. There's also discussions about using them in other applications that aren't so demanding, as such as stationary power storage. So I think it's a real issue. It needs research in terms of the research questions. We didn't address that issue in particular, but I'm not too concerned because they're economically valuable. It's not like you wouldn't throw something away because it's too valuable to throw away.
Actually, and it's interesting, you say you're from the Netherlands?
Poland.
Oh, Poland, okay. Well, then it's not as fun to tease you. I can't tease you because I don't think Poland has done this. But the Netherlands has announced, I don't know if it's law or it's just a proposal, to prevent any electric vehicles from being exported. So that's the first country that's talking about that. And it's really interesting because 2 years ago, in the international circles, like in the UN type, people worried about, right now, of course, plenty of old gasoline vehicles essentially get dumped into developing countries. There was fear that they were going to dump electric vehicles into developing countries and they'd have to deal with the batteries. I don't think it's going to happen. I think it's going to be the opposite. Countries are going to hold on to their electric vehicles. And then, very quickly, the debate kind of flips and becomes, well, wait a minute, what about developing countries getting access to electric vehicles? Let's not wall it off. So, interesting how that's happened.
Yeah, I was actually part of an NSERC research network on energy storage and batteries, and we made it our business to look at the end-of-life question. I am a little concerned partially because in North America, regulatory regimes are essentially non-existent, is the simple answer. It's impossible. We were unable to get basic information about where these things are going. Quebec and California are working on extended producer responsibility regimes, which make a lot of sense because the actual ways of recycling these things at the moment are pretty ugly. You either put them back into a smelter or you do hydrometallurgy, which basically means you melt them in acid and then try and leach out the cobalt and other stuff. It's not even clear if that works for lithium. It works for some of the heavier metals. So you probably, ideally, and then it links back to the critical minerals question I was raising earlier about what do the supply chains look like? Because if you can cycle these things, that reduces a lot of extractive pressure for new mining activities. Eventually. You're going to have to build up a stock of the materials at some point, and that part hasn't really thought through yet. I mean, the ideal is, at least in my mind, and where some of the literature seems to go, is well, you want to get to a design for disassembly situation. So you want to be designing so that you can remove the anodes and the cathodes, which is mostly where the valuable materials are, as opposed to trying to deal with the whole thing. The problem is that battery design at the moment is going in completely the opposite direction. They're going in the direction of welding, advanced adhesives. I have a colleague who autopsies the things. He's an engineer and talks about how it used to be you could unbolt them and take them apart when they're trying to figure out what's gone wrong. Now it's diamond saws and sledgehammers to get the things open. So there is no choice but to shred the whole thing into a smelter or a hydrometallurgical process with all kinds of casings, electrolyte, all kinds of, which just translates into pollutants and mess, and in fact, more energy input having to go in to do the recycling because you're having to deal with so much extraneous materials. So that seems to be where we're at. It's sort of know where we kind of know, I think, where we're going to get to. And we've had some interesting conversations with the mining people and the people who run the smelters who are kind of in the disassembly camp because they kind of said, yeah, we would prefer to maximize the portion of the stuff we want to recover that goes into the smelter and minimize the amount of the other stuff that goes into the smelter. But we have no regime yet to get us there. We're relying on the market. And it's not clear what the market's going to do given all those complications. So it's an interesting question. I mean, I think we will get somewhere, but it is quite striking. I mean, my students were on the phone to the various agencies in the U.S. and Canada, and I wish we could have recorded the crickets on the other end of the phone when we started asking questions about, we don't know, we're thinking about it. Because does this fall under the hazardous waste regime? Does this fall under your battery recycling regime? Are these dangerous goods? So they fall under transportation of dangerous goods. This was the answer.
That's very interesting.
Let's see if there were maybe one last question.
Sorry, you want to speak into? pour it in water, it starts burning and it can explode. And this is just from a single battery. But
This is one, speaking of unanswered research questions, that's one that's come up to which I have not seen an answer. It seems the heavy metals you can do, they know how to do. It's ugly, but you can do it. The lithium, there seems to be some debate about how much, and I'm not an engineer, I'm just an observer of the engineering conversations. There seems to be some doubt about how much of the lithium you can actually recover, partially because of its reactivity. So that one is out there in terms of you can get the cobalt and nickel and copper and other things you can get. There's ways of doing it, but the lithium seems to be a bit of a question mark in terms of how much you can actually recover.
Although I will, as I didn't point out, right, they can be used in stationary applications
Yes.
for quite some time.
No, you can get a second life
I
out
thought
of them for sure. And that could be part of your solutions in terms of charging infrastructures and distribution networks for sure.
If it's cost-effective compared to other options.
If it's cost effective, and there are concerns, sorry, I spent 5 years hanging out with engineers talking about this stuff, so it's, you may need to, again, it goes back to the design for disassembly questions. You may need to change out control units and things like that to be able to use them effectively as a grid asset, as opposed to the vehicular application, because they're still, they've got life in them. You will hit end of life eventually, but yes, there's a whole other set of questions around distributed resources and electricity systems and how they're dealt with, and that would be what would be the demand pull for second life batteries in the system.
Okay. Any final questions? There's one. Okay. I'll do one last one.
Hey, sorry, bringing it back to EVs, because everyone seemed excited about that, which confused me, because usually, car private ownership is opposed to emission reduction, right? The general narrative is that we should focus on mass transit. And you kind of answered this earlier, but I'd want to know if you could choose, 80% of all vehicles being electrified or 80% of cars, drivers going to public trans exclusively, right? Not ever buying a car again, right? 80 cars off the road. Which would be greater. But I also am interested in the policy perspective of giving subsidy dollars to corporations that then use that money to lobby politicians to stop environmental initiatives from going forward, right? Because a lot of the car companies have interests in oil and gas and not switching to electric and not having those regulations passed. The shareholders also have, own stocks in oil companies where we're giving them money, tax money, that they will use against us. Is that calculated in anywhere?
We're all going to back away from the microphones on that one.
Well, I mean, look. I think some of us believe that we passed the tipping point where if you don't switch and electrify now, you will not have a business 20 years from now. We could be wrong. I could be wrong, but I think we're past that because
For many companies.
But
Maybe not for everybody, but for many companies.
so
Although, there is a big difference between the automobile manufacturing industry and the energy producing industry. And your big oil and gas firms, even the ones that are sort of progressive, like BP and Shell, I was just talking to a guy from BP. They invest around $25 billion a year in new projects, and they're up to about $5 billion of it in renewables. So they're very proud of that, but it's still only 20% of their investments. They're still spending $20 billion a year on oil and gas, right? But they're kind of going in the right direction. Maybe if they get it to where 51% of their investments are going into renewables, then they'll flip, kind of. Then they'll be all in. It's going to be a long time before all those companies are like that. So. But it does seem like the auto manufacturing industry is much farther along on that process, so that's encouraging.
It's a very legitimate question. Probably more pointed in relation to the oil and gas industry, especially, given that we've been exceptionally generous with them through the tax system already.
Yeah.
But there's many layers to it. You know, there are others who would say, well, you're also, it's in the interest of the auto industry in the sense you are in some ways reinforcing automobile dependency in urban design, potentially. Now, there are reasons, as I've come to understand through this project, why that played out that way in California, because you probably can't do very much on the land use side. So this is probably what you're going to have to do. But that question is out there. I mean, one of the other dimensions of this is that which I'm puzzling over myself, is the extent to which in these transitions, incumbents seem to have a talent for coming out intact. That the technology may change, but that the big capital actors are still in one piece. Telecom would be a good example of that. That Bell and Rogers are doing just fine, despite the fact that the technology in the sector completely changed. So that is a possibility. That is a legitimate set of questions to ask in terms of where does the transition go.
Yeah, I agree. It's a definitely legitimate set of questions. I think all of the modeling, without exception, shows the only way we can get to zero carbon by 2050 is through vehicle electrification. You can't get there through just switching. You could if you believe that we could fundamentally change land use on this and every other continent, but I don't think that's politically, or I don't know. No one's even. I've never seen a scenario that actually did that. So
Well,
I think I just want to emphasize. I think on this time scale that we're trying to get to zero carbon, you have to electrify on that pathway to do it on that time scale, to electrify vehicles. So I think if we had a couple centuries to do this, I would say, great, let's go 80% transit and 20% personal cars, but I just don't think you can do it on that time scale. So that's my response.
Yeah, I mean, if there were a commitment, okay, Europe has, typically European cities are 50% walking and public transit, or in some cases higher. I don't know if there's any North American cities that get anywhere near that number, but it's kind of too late in a sense that we've built out our suburbs the way we have, and that's where many people live. And so, yeah, we can try to, and so it's about convincing people to become more urbanized and then investing that way. But some of that's happening. I was just in Cleveland. They're getting some good infill in Cleveland. It's encouraging, but it does take a long time.
It takes a long time.
I'm sorry. I'm from a rural state, and we have people, because of COVID, but not exclusively, moving there because they don't want an urban form. I think imposing that's an ideological opinion, and I have to say that urban is better. I think relatively clean, dispersed transportation from EVs is desirable for many people. And if you can't force people in a market economy to consume something they don't want. So I'm not that convinced that transit.
Well, yeah, and I didn't say we want to do that necessarily, but it would be up to having lots of people who did want to do it, enough people that it actually happened. And I guess in your state, it doesn't look like there will be.
And we're getting people from cities moving to very rural areas, and they have high-speed internet, and they're working, and they intend to stay working remotely.
Yeah.
So I don't see it.
Yeah, the pandemic didn't help. What you want is for us to all live in dense areas with buses. The pandemic was not your friend.
And Zoom and distance education, distance medical enables people to live. I don't think it's going to go back. I think that's old thinking. It's my view. Okay.
Well, maybe on that note, I'll just emphasize that we are back here after a hiatus of a couple years of Zoom. So we're very happy to have had our panelists here. Jonathan Rubin from University of Maine, Lou Fulton from UC Davis, James Bradbury from Georgetown Climate Center, and Mark Winfield from York University. Thank you very much, and maybe we'll give them all a hand.
Thank you, Mark. That
Thanks,
was
Mark.
Thanks a lot for organizing.
Thanks for
And,
coming and staying.
And this presentation is going to be, we have